The sound didn't echo. It cracked, sharp, sudden, final, like something breaking that was never supposed to be touched. For a split second, the entire courtroom froze, not in confusion, not in shock, but in something heavier. Silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from people choosing not to react. She didn't move. Her head had turned slightly from the impact, just enough for a strand of her hair to fall across her face. No scream, no gasp, no anger, just stillness. Imagine standing there, in a room built to represent justice, under the weight of fluorescent lights that hummed like they'd seen too much, surrounded by people who knew something was wrong and still chose to look away. The officer's hand lowered slowly, not because he regretted it, but because, in his mind, he had just put someone back in their place. "You don't speak unless you're spoken to," he muttered, loud enough for the first few rows to hear. A few quiet chuckles slipped through the benches, quick, nervous, complicit. The judge didn't say a word, didn't lift the gavel, didn't raise an eyebrow, just watched, like this was routine, like this was normal. She blinked once, slowly, then again. Her fingers, steady, controlled, rose to her cheek. Not to cradle the pain, but to measure it. There was no trembling, no hesitation, only calculation. Because this moment, this exact moment, wasn't new to her. The looks, the assumptions, the quiet permission people gave themselves when they thought no one important was watching. She had seen it before, documented it, endured it, but today felt different. Not because of the slap, but because of what came after. The officer took a step back, adjusting his uniform like nothing had happened, like he still owned the room, like the badge on his chest gave him the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. "You people always think you can walk in here like you matter," he added, his voice colder now. The words landed heavier than the strike. Not louder, just deeper. And still, she said nothing. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat. A pen dropped. A chair creaked. Small sounds. Tiny cracks in a system pretending to be solid. Then she moved. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just enough to make people realize she had never lost control. Her chin lifted slightly. Her eyes met his. Not with anger. Not with fear. But with something far more dangerous, certainty. "Are you done?" Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Because in that moment, it carried something the entire room had been missing. Authority. The officer scoffed. A mistake. A small one. The kind that doesn't feel like a mistake until it becomes the beginning of the end. Because what he didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that the woman he had just humiliated in front of everyone wasn't just another defendant, wasn't just another voice to silence. She was waiting, not to fight back, not to argue, but to reveal the truth. And when she did, this courtroom, this officer, this entire illusion of control would never be the same again. The room didn't recover. Not after her voice. Not after those 3 words. "Are you done?" They didn't sound like a question. They sounded like a line drawn. And somehow, everyone in that courtroom felt it. The officer shifted his weight, a faint crease forming between his brows, just for a second. Then it disappeared, replaced by that same smug confidence, the kind built over years of never being challenged. "Careful," he said, stepping closer again. "You're already in enough trouble." His tone dropped, quieter now, but sharper. "Don't make it worse." She held his gaze, unblinking, unmoved. If you were watching closely, really closely, you'd notice something strange. It wasn't fear in her eyes. It wasn't anger either. It was patience. And that's what made it dangerous. Because while the room thought the moment had already happened, the slap, the humiliation, the silence, they didn't realize the real moment was just beginning. A clerk near the side table adjusted a stack of files with shaky hands. A juror leaned forward slightly, confusion creeping into his expression. Even the judge, who had remained detached until now, finally shifted in his seat. Something was off. They could feel it, but they couldn't explain it. The officer exhaled sharply, clearly irritated now. "Bailiff," he called out without looking away from her. "Remove her if she can't follow basic instructions." No response. He frowned. "Bailiff." Still nothing. Because the bailiff wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking at her. Not with authority. Not with suspicion. With recognition. That was the first crack. Small. Almost invisible. But enough. She reached down calmly, fingers brushing against the edge of her bag resting beside the table. No sudden movement. No tension. Just deliberate control. The officer's eyes followed the motion instantly. Don't. He snapped. Too fast, too defensive. She paused, then looked up at him again. And for the first time, there was something new in her expression. Not emotion. Not reaction. Decision. You really should have let me speak earlier, she said quietly. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Soft, uneasy, like something beneath the surface had just shifted. The officer laughed under his breath, dismissive. Yeah? And what exactly were you going to say? She didn't answer. Not immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag. Slowly, carefully. This time, no one stopped her. Not the officer. Not the judge. Not anyone. Because something in the air had changed. That invisible line had already been crossed. She pulled out a slim, dark leather wallet. Worn, precise, official, and placed it gently on the table. The sound it made wasn't loud, but it carried. She flipped it open, turned it, slid it across the surface toward him. Read it, she said. The officer didn't move at first. Didn't want to. Didn't think he needed to. But something in the room, the silence, the eyes, the shift, forced his hand. He reached forward, picked it up, and the moment his eyes dropped to the badge inside, everything changed. The color drained from his face. Because staring back at him wasn't just a name. Not just a title. It was authority he couldn't override, power he couldn't silence, and a mistake he couldn't undo. Behind him, someone stood up abruptly. A chair scraped loudly against the floor. Footsteps, fast, controlled, official. The courtroom doors opened. And this time, power walked in. The door didn't just open. It shifted the room. Every head turned. Every whisper died before it could form. And even the air seemed to tighten as if something invisible had just taken control. Footsteps followed, measured, heavy, certain. Not rushed, not uncertain. Commanding. The officer didn't turn around immediately. He couldn't. His eyes were still locked on the badge in his hand, still trying to process what he was seeing, still hoping, desperately, that he had read it wrong. He hadn't. Officer. The voice came from behind him. Calm. Controlled. But layered with something that didn't need volume to dominate. Authority. Now he turned. Slowly. Reluctantly. Two uniformed military officers stepped into the courtroom. Their presence didn't need explanation. It didn't need introduction. It was the kind of presence that doesn't ask for attention, it takes it. The first officer's gaze swept the room once, then landed directly on him, sharp and unforgiving. Is there a reason, he said, each word precise, why a U.S. Marine officer is being restrained and assaulted in a civilian courtroom? No one answered. Not the judge, not the bailiff, not even the officer himself, because there was no answer that could fix this. The courtroom, just minutes ago filled with quiet arrogance and routine indifference, was now something else entirely. Still, tense, watching. The officer swallowed. His grip on the leather wallet loosened. Sir, he started. Don't. The second officer stepped forward, closer now, close enough that the difference between them wasn't just rank, it was reality. You've said enough. Behind them, the woman stood as she had before, calm, unshaken. But now everyone saw her differently. Not as a defendant, not as a problem, not as someone to be controlled, but as someone who had been in control the entire time. The judge cleared his throat, finally finding his voice. This is highly irregular. It is, the first officer interrupted, without even looking at him. And it's about to become a formal incident. Silence fell again, but this time it wasn't passive. It was pressure. The officer who had thrown the slap took a step back, then another. His confidence, so solid just minutes ago, was gone, replaced by something far more human. Fear. I didn't know, he said quickly, his voice tightening. No, the Marine officer replied coldly. You didn't. A pause. Heavy. Deliberate. And that's exactly the problem. Somewhere in the back row, someone shifted. A pen scratched nervously against paper. No one dared speak. Because now, this wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a reckoning. The second officer turned slightly, glancing toward the woman, giving a subtle nod of respect. Ma'am, he said. Just one word, but everything changed with it. No one had called her that before. Not when she walked in. Not when she was insulted. Not when she was struck. But now they all understood. She stepped forward, slow, controlled, certain. Each step echoing just enough to remind everyone that this moment now belonged to her. Her eyes met the officer's again, but this time, he couldn't hold her gaze. "You had every chance to stop," she said, her voice steady, never loud. "And you chose not to." The words didn't hit like anger. They landed like judgment. Final. The military officer beside her turned back to the room. "Effective immediately, this incident is under federal review." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Sharp. Unavoidable. Bodycam footage, courtroom surveillance. All records secured. The officer's face went pale. Because this wasn't just about a slap anymore. It was about everything. Every report. Every complaint. Every time he thought no one was watching. And now, someone had been. The woman looked at him one last time. Not with hatred. Not with satisfaction. But with something far heavier. "Truth. You didn't hit a stranger," she said quietly. A beat passed. "You hit accountability." And just like that, everything he thought he controlled was gone. The shift didn't settle. It spread. Slow at first, like a crack beneath the surface, then faster, sharper, until the entire courtroom felt like it was standing on something unstable. Because once authority changes hands, everything else starts to fall apart. The officer stood there, frozen in place. Not restrained, not ordered, just unable to move. His eyes darted, first to the military officers, then to the judge, then back to her, searching for something. Support, control, an exit. There was none. "Place your hands where I can see them." The command came clean, direct, final. For a second, he didn't react. Not because he didn't hear it, but because his mind hadn't caught up to reality yet. "I said hands." This time sharper. Slowly, almost mechanically, his hands lifted. The same hands that had struck her minutes ago, now held in the air for everyone to see. And for the first time, he understood what it felt like. Not power, not authority, exposure. A quiet gasp rippled through the room. Not loud, but enough. Because the image had flipped completely. The man who walked in believing he owned the room was now standing in the center of it, stripped of everything that gave him that belief. The first military officer stepped closer, calm and controlled. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. "You are being detained pending federal investigation for assaulting a U.S. Marine officer," he said. Each word landed like a stamp. Official, irreversible. The officer shook his head quickly. No, this is a misunderstanding. I was just careful." The interruption came instantly, cold. Because now, excuses didn't carry weight. Evidence did. From the side of the room, another figure stepped forward, a court technician, hands slightly trembling as he held a tablet. "Sir, the cameras recorded everything." Of course they did. The officer's breath hitched, just slightly, but enough. Because deep down, he already knew. This wasn't about explaining what happened. It was about proving that it happened. And everyone had seen it. The judge shifted again, this time more noticeably, posture straighter, voice tighter. "We will adjourn this session immediately." But no one moved. Because for once, the courtroom wasn't following his lead. It was following hers. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't demanded control, hadn't fought for attention. And yet, she had it. Completely. She stepped forward again, just one step, enough to close the distance between her and the officer. He couldn't look at her. Not anymore. "You thought this was about control," she said quietly. No response. "You thought if you were loud enough, aggressive enough, no one would question you." The words settled into the room, not like accusations, but like truth, unavoidable. He swallowed hard, still silent. Because what could he say? That he didn't mean it? That he reacted too quickly? That he misjudged? None of that mattered anymore. Because intent doesn't erase action, and power doesn't erase consequence. The second officer moved behind him, securing his wrists. The click of restraints echoed louder than the slap ever did. Final. Around the room, people shifted again, but this time not from discomfort, from realization that this moment wasn't rare, just rarely seen through to the end. She watched quietly as it unfolded. No satisfaction, no smile. Because this wasn't revenge. This was correction. The officer was guided toward the exit, step by step, slower than he had ever walked before. And just before he reached the door, he stopped. Not by force, by instinct. He turned his head slightly, not enough to face her, just enough to speak. "I didn't know." Her response came without hesitation. "You didn't need to." A beat. To treat someone with respect. The door opened. And this time, he walked out without power, without control, without the badge meaning what it used to. Only consequence. The door closed behind him, and for the first time since it all began, the courtroom breathed. But not the same way, because something had changed. Something permanent. Not just in that room, but in every person who had watched and said nothing. She turned slightly, preparing to leave, calm, collected, as if none of this had shaken her. But just before she stepped away, she paused. Not for them. For the moment. Because moments like this don't come often. And when they do, they don't just end stories. They start new ones. The courtroom didn't return to normal. It couldn't. Because what had just happened didn't just remove a man, it exposed a system. For a few seconds after the door closed, no one spoke. Not the judge. Not the clerks. Not the spectators. Just the faint hum of the lights above and the weight of everything that had just unfolded. She stood there, still composed, still steady, but now the silence around her felt different. It wasn't dismissal anymore. It was attention. Real attention. The judge cleared his throat again, this time more carefully, more measured, almost cautious. "Ma'am," he began, the word unfamiliar on his tongue. "The court would like clarification on your presence here today." A different tone. A different man. She turned toward him slowly, not rushed, not defensive. "I'm here because of case 417B, she said. Her voice remained calm, but now every word carried weight. A clerk scrambled through files. Papers shuffled faster than before. "The internal misconduct report," she continued. "Filed 6 months ago. Reopened under federal review." A ripple moved through the room again, but this time it wasn't shock. It was realization. Because suddenly, this wasn't random. This wasn't an isolated moment of abuse. This was connected. The judge's expression tightened. "You're saying this incident is part of a larger investigation?" She held his gaze. "Yes." One word. But it changed everything. Because now, this wasn't about one officer losing control. It was about how many times he hadn't been stopped. She stepped toward the table, placing both hands lightly on its surface, grounded, certain. "He wasn't being watched today," she said quietly. A pause. "He's been watched for months." The courtroom shifted again, not physically, but mentally. Every person in that room started replaying what they had seen before, what they had ignored, what they had justified. The complaints didn't disappear, she continued. They were buried. A clerk stopped writing. A witness withdrew. A report went missing. A camera malfunctioned. Each sentence landed like evidence already proven. "And today," she said, her eyes sweeping the room slowly, "you all saw why." No one argued. No one objected. Because they had. The judge leaned back slightly, the authority he once carried now tempered with something new. Concern. "What happens next?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her folder and pulled out a thin stack of documents. Clean, organized, prepared. She placed them on the table. "Next," she said, "we stop pretending this is isolated." Another pause. "And we start treating it like a pattern." The word lingered. Pattern. Because patterns don't disappear with one arrest. They require exposure. Accountability. Change. From the back of the room, a voice finally spoke, soft, uncertain. "Does this go beyond him?" She turned slightly, meeting the question without hesitation. "Yes." The air tightened again. Because now, this wasn't just about one man walking out in cuffs. It was about everyone who had stood still while it happened. Everyone who had signed off, looked away, stayed silent. The judge glanced down at the documents, then back at her. "This court will cooperate fully," he said. A statement, but more than that, a correction. She gave a small nod. Not approval, not gratitude. Acknowledgement. Because this wasn't about her. It never was. It was about the truth finally having nowhere left to hide. She gathered her things calmly. No rush. No drama. And as she turned toward the exit, the same doors that had once framed her humiliation now stood open without resistance. But before she stepped through, she paused. Not to look back at the officer. He was gone. But at the room. At the people. At the system. "You don't fix this with apologies," she said quietly. A final line. "You fix it by not letting it happen again." And then she walked out. Not as a victim. Not as someone who fought back. But as someone who made sure it wouldn't happen the same way twice. The courtroom remained. Changed, watching, thinking. Because justice hadn't just shown up that day. It had spoken. And this time, no one could pretend they didn't hear it. The hallway outside the courtroom was quieter than it should have been. Not empty, just restrained, like the building itself was holding its breath. Her footsteps echoed softly against the polished floor, measured, unhurried, the same way she had walked in. But everything was different now. Behind her, the courtroom doors remained closed. Inside, voices had started again, low, urgent, no longer confident, no longer controlled. Because once truth enters a room, it doesn't leave quietly. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. At the far end of the hallway, 2 federal agents stood waiting. Not tense, not alarmed, prepared. One of them stepped forward as she approached. "Ma'am," he said, handing her a tablet. "We've secured the officer. Internal Affairs is already requesting transfer." She took the tablet, glanced at the screen, footage timestamps, incident logs, previous complaints. A pattern, clearer now than ever. "Good," she said simply. No satisfaction in her voice. No sense of victory. Because this wasn't the end. It was confirmation. The second agent spoke, quieter. "There's more." She looked up. "The judge," he continued. "He signed off on at least 3 of the dismissed reports tied to this officer." A pause. Not surprise. Recognition. "Bring everything in," she said. "No gaps this time." The agent nodded immediately, because now they understood something the courtroom had just learned. Silence was part of the system too. She handed the tablet back and continued walking. Past offices. Past closed doors. Past people who suddenly avoided eye contact. Not long ago, she would have been invisible here. Now every step she took carried weight. At the end of the corridor, a large window stretched from floor to ceiling. Sunlight poured in, bright, unforgiving. She stopped there, just for a moment. Outside, the world moved normally. Cars passed. People crossed streets. Life continued, unaffected. But inside, something had shifted. Because moments like that don't stay contained. They ripple. Into reports. Into headlines. Into conversations people can't ignore anymore. Behind her, footsteps approached again, faster this time. "Ma'am." She turned slightly. A younger officer. Nervous. Hesitant. I was in the courtroom," he said. "I saw what happened." She studied him for a second. Not judging. Not inviting. Just listening. He swallowed. "You were right," he added. "About it not being isolated." A pause. "I filed a complaint once," he continued. "It went nowhere." There it was. Another piece. Another silence. She nodded once. "Then file it again." His brows tightened. "Will it matter this time?" She held his gaze, steady, certain. "It already does." The answer wasn't loud, but it landed. Because change doesn't start when systems decide to act. It starts when people stop accepting how they work. The young officer nodded slowly, something shifting behind his eyes. Not fear. Resolve. He turned and walked away. And just like that, the ripple spread again. She looked back out the window one last time. Calm. Focused. Because this was never about one courtroom. Or one officer. Or even one moment. It was about everything that led to it. And everything that would come after. She adjusted her jacket slightly, then stepped forward, out of the building, into the light. Not chasing justice, but carrying it with her. And somewhere behind her, systems were already beginning to crack. Not loudly. Not all at once. But enough. Enough to know this wasn't over. It was just finally beginning. Outside, the air felt different. Cleaner. Not because anything had changed in the world, but because something had finally changed inside it. The courthouse doors closed behind her with a low, heavy thud. Final. Not just the end of a moment, but the closing of a chapter that had been open far too long. She stepped onto the concrete steps, sunlight washing over her face. Warm, honest, unlike the fluorescent cold she had just left behind. A black SUV waited at the curb, engine running, doors closed. But she didn't move toward it. Not yet, because across the street, people had already gathered. Not a crowd. Not chaos. Witnesses. Some held phones. Some whispered. Some just stood there, watching the courthouse like something inside it had finally cracked open. They didn't know everything. Not the files. Not the months of investigation. But they knew something happened. And sometimes, that's where change begins. One of the agents stepped beside her. "You want to head out?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes scanned the street. The people. The quiet curiosity turning into awareness. "Not yet," she said. Because this moment wasn't just for the courtroom. It was for them. She stepped forward, just a few steps down, enough to be seen clearly. The murmurs softened. Phones lifted a little higher. But she didn't speak to the cameras. Didn't perform. She spoke the same way she had inside. Calm, steady, undeniable. What happened in there, a pause, wasn't new. The words landed heavier than any headline ever could. It just wasn't seen. A man in the crowd lowered his phone slightly. A woman beside him nodded, almost instinctively. Accountability doesn't start when something goes viral, she continued. It starts when people stop looking away. No shouting, no anger, just truth. And that made it louder than anything else. Behind her, the courthouse doors opened again. More officials stepping out. More movement. More urgency. Because now, this wasn't contained. It was visible. She turned slightly, glancing back at the building. For a moment, just a moment, her expression shifted. Not pride. Not relief. Recognition. Of how long it took to get here. Of how much further it still had to go. Then it was gone. She stepped toward the SUV. The agent opened the door. Before getting in, she paused one last time, looking back at the people, the cameras, the street, and said quietly, not to one person, but to everyone listening, power doesn't protect the truth. A beat. It delays it. She got in. The door closed. The SUV pulled away slowly, merging into the flow of the city. Behind it, the courthouse stood the same, stone, silent, unmoving. But inside, everything was different now. Phones were ringing. Files were being reopened. Names were being questioned. And somewhere deep within those walls, people who had once felt untouchable were starting to understand something they had ignored for too long. That silence isn't protection. It's evidence. And today, someone finally chose to hear it. The city moved on. Cars passed. Voices blended into noise. But beneath it all, something had shifted. Not loudly. Not instantly. But permanently. Because justice didn't arrive with sirens. Didn't demand attention. It walked in quietly. Took the hit. Waited. And then, when the moment was right, it revealed itself. And once it does, it doesn't leave unnoticed again. The SUV didn't go far. Not at first. It moved with the rhythm of the city, slow, controlled, blending into traffic like nothing inside it mattered. But inside, everything did. She sat in silence, eyes forward, hands resting calmly in her lap. No tension, no release. Just focus. Across from her, the agent glanced down at his phone, then back up. They're already picking it up, he said. Local media. Internal channels. It's spreading. She didn't react. Because attention was never the goal. Truth was. And IA just confirmed, he added, scrolling. 3 more officers connected to prior complaints have been pulled for questioning. A pause. That was fast. It had to be, she replied. Because when pressure finally breaks through, systems don't move slowly anymore. They scramble. The SUV turned onto a wider road. Sunlight flickered across the windows in steady intervals. Light, shadow, like everything they had just exposed. Ma'am, the driver spoke this time, eyes still on the road. Command wants to know if you're returning to base or continuing the operation. That word lingered. Operation. Because what happened in that courtroom was never the mission. It was just the trigger. She looked out the window at people walking, at conversations continuing, at a world that hadn't realized yet how close it had come to staying the same. Continue, she said. No hesitation. The agent nodded once, already sending the message. Understood. Phase 2. Phase 2. That's where things stopped being visible and started becoming irreversible. He turned the screen toward her. Names, dates, locations, patterns. Departments linked through quiet approvals. Cases dismissed without explanation. Officers transferred instead of investigated. A network. Not written anywhere, but present everywhere. They didn't think anyone would connect it, the agent said quietly. They didn't think anyone was supposed to, she replied. Because systems like that don't survive through force. They survive through assumption. The assumption that no one will look closely enough. The SUV slowed and pulled into an underground garage. Concrete. Shadow. Silence. The doors opened. She stepped out first. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just certain. Because this part didn't need witnesses. Inside, a temporary command space had already been set up. Screens, files, people moving with purpose. No confusion. No hesitation. Because they had been waiting. One of the senior officers approached immediately. Ma'am, We've mapped the connections. It's bigger than we thought. She didn't stop walking. Show me. He fell and stepped beside her, pulling up a projection, lines connecting names, departments crossing jurisdictions, reports looping back into silence. This isn't just misconduct, he said. It's systemic. She studied the screen, every line, every link. Not surprised. Confirmed. Start with the weakest point, she said. He blinked. Ma'am, the one most likely to talk, she clarified. Because truth doesn't break systems all at once. It fractures them. One voice, then another. Then the structure can't hold itself together anymore. He nodded quickly. Already flagged. Officer Daniels. Multiple sealed complaints. Requested transfer twice. Bring him in. No anger. No urgency. Just inevitability. Around them, the room shifted into motion. Orders passed. Files pulled. Doors opened. Because now, this wasn't about proving anything. That had already been done. This was about what came next. And what came next wasn't loud. Wasn't public. But it was final. She stepped closer to the screen one last time, eyes steady, mind already moving ahead. Because she knew something they were only beginning to understand. That justice doesn't end when the truth is revealed. That's when it actually begins. And somewhere, behind every closed door they were about to open, there were more moments like that courtroom. More silence. More assumptions. More people who thought no one was watching. They were wrong. And now, they were about to find out. They didn't bring him in with force. They didn't need to. Officer Daniels walked into the room on his own, slow, measured, like a man who already knew this wasn't a conversation he could control. The door closed behind him with a soft click. No echo. No drama. But everyone in the room felt it. He glanced around once, at the screens, at the files, at the faces that didn't look away this time. Then his eyes landed on her. And stayed there. You're the one from the courtroom, he said. Not a question. A realization. She didn't answer. Because she didn't need to. He exhaled slowly, ran a hand across the back of his neck. I figured something like this would happen eventually, he added. A quiet admission. Not of guilt, but of expectation. Because deep down, he had always known. Sit, one of the agents said. Daniels didn't argue. Didn't hesitate. He pulled out the chair and lowered himself into it. Not defeated, but no longer pretending. The room settled. Screens dimmed slightly. Focus narrowed. She stepped forward and placed a thin file in front of him. His file. He didn't open it. Didn't need to. I didn't hit anyone, he said quickly. Too quickly. No one responded. Because that wasn't the point. She leaned slightly forward. Direct, not aggressive, not distant. This isn't about what you did today, she said. A pause. It's about what you saw. That made him look up. Really look this time. Because that question wasn't what he expected. His jaw tightened. I don't know what you think You signed off, she interrupted calmly. A page flipped open. 3 reports. Same officer. Same pattern. Another page. 2 witness withdrawals. Another. 1 missing file. Silence. Daniel stared at the papers now. Not denying. Not arguing. Remembering. You were there, she continued. Not accusing. Stating. And you said nothing. The words didn't rise. They settled. Heavy. Because they were true. His shoulders shifted slightly. I followed procedure, he said. A familiar line. A safe one. Or at least, it used to be. She nodded once. I know. That confused him. Because he expected resistance, pushback, pressure. Not agreement. That's the problem, she added. A beat. Procedure protected him. The room went still again. Because now this wasn't about individual actions. It was about the system that made them possible. Daniels looked down at his hands. You don't understand how it works, he said quietly. She didn't respond immediately. Because she did. Better than he thought. Then explain it, she said. No edge. No challenge. Just space. And for the first time, he hesitated. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he did. And saying it out loud would make it real. They tell you to trust the chain, he said slowly. To not make noise unless you're sure. A pause. And when you are sure, he stopped. Didn't finish. Didn't need to. Because everyone in the room already knew the ending. Nothing happens. Files disappear. Complaints stall. People move on. And the system stays intact. She watched him carefully. Not judging. Not pushing. Waiting. Because this moment, this exact moment, was the fracture. The point where silence either continues or breaks. You can keep protecting it, she said quietly. Or She slid a single document forward and signed. Or you can tell the truth. Daniel stared at it. A pen rested beside the paper. Simple, but heavier than anything else in the room. Because this wasn't about guilt. It was about choice. The kind that doesn't just affect one person, but everything connected to them. His fingers moved slightly, then stopped, then moved again, slowly reaching for the pen. Around the room, no one spoke. No one moved. Because they all understood, this was how systems actually break. Not with force, not with exposure alone, but with someone inside choosing not to stay silent anymore. The pen lifted, hovered, and for a moment, everything held still. Because once he signed, there would be no going back. And somewhere, deep beneath layers of silence and procedure, truth was finally being given a voice. The pen didn't drop. It didn't shake. But it didn't move forward either. For a moment, Daniels just sat there, holding it. Not writing. Not deciding. Just feeling the weight of it. Because this wasn't paperwork. This was consequence. And consequence has a way of cutting through every excuse a person has ever used. The room stayed silent. No one rushed him. No one pressured him. Because this choice had to be his. His grip tightened slightly, then loosened. You think this fixes it? He asked quietly. Not defensive. Not aggressive. Tired. She didn't answer immediately. Because the question wasn't simple. No, she said finally. Honest. It starts it. That landed differently. Because deep down, he knew there was no single moment that could undo everything that had already happened. But there were moments that made sure it couldn't keep happening. He looked down at the paper again. Blank. Waiting. Like everything he had. Avoided saying. They'll come after me, he muttered. Not fear. Reality. Maybe, she said. No promises. No false reassurance. But they won't be able to pretend anymore. A pause. And neither will you. That was it. That was the line. Because fear protects silence. But truth takes that protection away. His jaw tightened. His eyes closed briefly. Not to escape. To decide. And when they opened again, something had shifted. Not confidence. Clarity. The pen touched the paper. Slowly. Carefully. Then he signed. No dramatic moment. No sound. Just ink meeting truth. Permanent. Final. Around the room, no one reacted. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. Because they all knew this wasn't just one statement. It was a breach. And once something like that opens, it doesn't close again. The agent stepped forward, collecting the document without a word. Already moving. Already processing. Because now everything would move faster. Much faster. Daniels leaned back in his chair. Not relieved, but lighter. Like something he had been carrying without realizing had finally been put down. What happens to him, he asked. She didn't need clarification. The officer. A pause. He faces what everyone else should have, she said. Accountability. Daniels nodded slowly. Not satisfied, but understanding. Because for the first time, that word meant something real. Across the room, screens began updating. New flags. New connections. New names lighting up. Because one truth always leads to another. And another. And another. Until the system that once hid everything can't hide anything at all. She turned slightly, watching it unfold. Calm. Focused. Because this was the part people never saw. Not the confrontation. Not the moment of impact. But the unraveling. Quiet. Precise. Unstoppable. Behind her, someone spoke. Ma'am, we're getting confirmations from 2 more departments. She didn't turn. Good, she said. Because this wasn't about one building. One courtroom. One officer. It never was. It was about the pattern. And now, the pattern was breaking. She looked back at Daniels one last time. Not as a suspect. Not as a victim of the system. But as someone who had made a choice. A hard one. A necessary one. You did the right thing, she said. Not comfort. Recognition. He didn't respond. But he didn't need to. Because in that moment, for the first time, he believed it. And as the room continued to move, files opening, calls being made, systems shifting, one thing became clear. This wasn't slowing down. It wasn't fading out. It was accelerating. Because once truth finds a voice, it doesn't stop speaking. And now, there were too many voices to silence. Too many records to erase. Too many eyes finally open. And somewhere, in offices that had once felt untouchable, phones were ringing. Not with routine, but with consequence. This wasn't the end. Not even close. This was the collapse beginning. The room didn't slow down. It tightened. Because once the first truth is spoken, The next one doesn't wait. A screen at the far end of the command center flickered, then stabilized. "Ma'am," an analyst called out, voice sharper now. "We've got a match." She turned. From Daniel's statement, he continued, cross-referenced with internal transfers, "There's a name coming up repeatedly." A pause. "Captain Reeves." The room reacted this time, not loudly, but noticeably, because that name wasn't small. Supervisory rank. Internal authority. The kind of position that doesn't just ignore problems, it decides what happens to them. "Pull everything," she said immediately. Files opened. Timelines expanded. Connections redrew themselves on the screen. And there it was. Clear. Undeniable. Every complaint that vanished, every report that stalled, every officer quietly reassigned, all of it led back to him. "He's been shielding them," the analyst said. "No," she corrected calmly. "He's been managing the system. Because protection is reactive. This was structured, intentional, controlled." Another agent stepped forward. "Ma'am, he's still active, still in command." That mattered, because power doesn't disappear just because it's exposed. It resists. "Location?" she asked. "Headquarters. 5th floor." She nodded once. "Then we don't wait." The room shifted instantly. Because this wasn't an investigation anymore. This was intervention. Agents moved. Equipment gathered. Orders passed in low, precise voices. No panic. Just purpose. Daniels looked up from his chair, watching it unfold. "This goes higher than him," he said quietly. She glanced at him. "I know. Because systems like that don't build themselves around one person. But they do start to collapse when one person is removed." She stepped toward the exit, then paused, turning back slightly. "Stay available," she told Daniels. Not a command. A reminder. Because his part wasn't over. Not yet. He nodded, this time without hesitation. Because now, he was part of what came next. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. She stepped inside with 2 agents. The doors closed. And as the elevator began to rise, the atmosphere shifted again, tighter, heavier. Because this was different. This wasn't exposing what had already happened. This was confronting what was still in power. Floor numbers lit up one by one. 2, 3, 4. No one spoke. No one needed to. Because they all knew what waited on the 5th floor. The doors opened. Silence. A hallway lined with offices. Closed doors. Controlled order. The illusion of everything being exactly how it should be. She stepped out first. Calm, steady, unstoppable. At the end of the corridor, a door. Nameplate polished. Captain Reeves. She didn't knock. She opened it. Inside, a man looked up from his desk. Unbothered. At first. "Can I help?" Then he saw the faces. The posture. The intent. And something changed. Not panic. Recognition. Because unlike the others, he understood immediately. This wasn't a mistake. This was the moment catching up to him. She stepped forward. No raised voice. No threat. Just presence. "Captain Reeves," she said. A pause. "We need to talk." And for the first time, in a system built on control, someone wasn't asking. Captain Reeves didn't stand up immediately. He didn't need to. Men like him weren't used to reacting. They were used to controlling the pace of every room they walked into. So instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes narrowing, measuring. "I assume this is important," he said calmly. Not defensive, not surprised. Controlled. Because unlike the others, he had already calculated. This moment long before it arrived. She stepped further into the office. The agents behind her remained silent, still. "You've been very busy," she said. No accusation. No emotion. Just a statement. Reeves gave a faint smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "I run a department," he replied. "That tends to happen. Deflection. Clean. Practiced." But it didn't land. She placed a folder on his desk. Not forcefully, just enough to break the space between them. He didn't open it. Because he already knew what was inside. "Complaints disappear under your review," she said. "Officers get reassigned instead of investigated. Reports stall the moment they reach your desk." Each line precise. Measured. Reeves' expression didn't change. "You're making assumptions," he said after a pause. "And accusations without context. Still controlled. Still playing the role. Because that's what people like him rely on, ambiguity." But she didn't argue. Didn't push back. She simply reached forward and flipped the folder open. Photos. Timelines. Signatures. Patterns. All aligned. All undeniable. The air shifted. Reeves' eyes dropped to the documents, just for a second. That was all it took. Because in that second, he stopped pretending he didn't recognize it. You built this, she said quietly. Not aloud. Not missed. Built. That word landed. Because it meant intent. Design. Ownership. He leaned forward now, elbows on the desk, hands clasped. You think you understand how this works? He asked. There it was. Not denial. Justification. Because when people like him realize they're exposed, they don't defend the action. They defend the system. You call it corruption, he continued. I call it stability. A beat. You remove people every time there's a complaint. He shook his head slightly. You don't have a department left. Silence. Because that was the truth he believed in. The logic that kept everything in place. Flawed, but powerful. She held his gaze, unshaken. No, she said. A pause. You just finally have a real one. For the first time, his expression shifted, just slightly. Because that answer didn't fit into the system he had built. Behind her, one of the agents stepped forward and placed a second document on the desk. A warrant. Signed. Final. This is a formal federal seizure of all records under your authority, the agent said. Reeves didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on her. Because now this wasn't about the documents. It was about the moment. You think this ends with me? He asked quietly. Not a threat. A warning. Because deep down, he knew the truth too. It never ends with one person. She nodded once. I know it doesn't. A beat. That's why we started here. That was it. The line he couldn't step around. The one he couldn't control. The agent moved behind him. You need to stand up, sir. For the first time, Reeves didn't respond immediately. Because for the first time, he wasn't in control of the outcome. Slowly he stood. Not resisting, but not accepting either. Just adjusting. Because people like him don't collapse loudly. They unravel quietly. The cuffs clicked. Soft. Final. And just like that, the system lost its center. Not all at once. But enough. Enough for everything else to start falling. She watched him for a moment. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. But with clarity. Because this was never about revenge. It was about ending something that had been allowed to exist for far too long. As they led him toward the door, he stopped briefly. You'll see, he said. They'll rebuild it. She didn't hesitate. Then we'll tear it down again. No emotion. Just truth. The door opened. And this time, it wasn't just one man walking out. It was everything he had been holding together starting to come apart. The building didn't shake. No alarms. No chaos. But something inside it was gone. Captain Reeves was escorted down the same hallway he had walked through for years. The same walls. The same doors. But nothing felt the same. People stepped aside. Not out of respect. Out of recognition. Because power doesn't disappear quietly. It gets seen. And once it's seen, it can't hide the same way again. She didn't follow him. She didn't need to. Her part in that moment was already done. Instead, she stood in the corridor, watching the aftermath unfold. Doors opening. Voices lowering. Names being whispered differently now. Not with fear. With awareness. Because something had changed. Not just in leadership, but in perception. The agent beside her glanced at his phone. They're confirming it across departments, he said. Suspensions. Reviews. Emergency audits. She nodded once. Because this was the ripple. Not loud. Not instant. But unstoppable. Somewhere behind those walls, people were already doing what they had avoided for years, looking closer. At files. At decisions. At themselves. She turned toward the window at the end of the hall. Sunlight poured in again. The same as before. But it felt different now. Not because the world had changed, but because the truth inside it had nowhere left to hide. Footsteps approached behind her. Daniels. He stopped a few feet away. Didn't speak immediately. I saw them take him, he said quietly. She didn't turn. That doesn't happen, he added. Not to people like him. Now she looked at him. It does, she said. A beat. When people stopped protecting them. That stayed with him. You could see it. Because this wasn't just about Reeves. It was about everything Daniels had accepted as normal, and how quickly that word had just lost its meaning. What happens now, he asked. The same question. Different weight. She looked out the window again. Now, she said, it continues. Because justice doesn't end with exposure. It lives in what happens after. In the decisions. The follow-through. The refusal to go back. Behind them, a group of officers passed by, quieter than before, more careful. Because they knew someone was watching now. Not from above. From within. Daniels nodded slowly. then turned, not away from it, toward it, toward the work, toward the part he hadn't played before. She watched him go, not with pride, not with certainty, but with something more grounded. Possibility. Because systems don't change overnight. But people do. And when enough of them decide to, everything else has to follow. She adjusted her jacket once more, then walked down the hallway. Not rushed, not triumphant, just steady. Because this wasn't a victory. It was a beginning. And somewhere behind her, phones kept ringing, files kept opening, truth kept moving. Quietly, relentlessly, until one day, it wouldn't need to fight this hard just to be heard. She reached the exit, paused just briefly, then stepped outside. Into the same world. But not the same story. Because that day, something changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but permanently. And the man who thought he was the law learned something too late. The law doesn't belong to power. It belongs to truth.